Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into something, well, fundamental, how we actually learn skills.
Yeah, absolutely.
Forget textbooks for a sec. Just think about your own life, right? That first time trying to tie your shoes, maybe.
Oh, yeah, wobbly.
Totally. Or learning to ride a bike, that frustration, and then finally getting it.
Uh-huh. Yep, Bernie getting the hang of some tricky software at work.
Or even mastering a musical piece.
Oh, yeah.
There's this fascinating journey we all go on, from clumsy beginner to, well, maybe not always expert, but confident performer.
And science actually has some incredible insights into what's happening under the hood.
It's a process that's so ingrained we often don't even think about it.
Exactly. But understanding the science, that can unlock potential, whether you're learning yourself or maybe helping someone else learn.
Right. You gave us a stack of sources exploring this, articles, research, notes covering, well, everything from classic psychological models
To
to...
newer biological and ecological ideas. Yeah.
So our mission today is to cut through the jargon, pull out the really important nuggets.
Give you a shortcut, basically.
Yeah, a shortcut to understanding this whole process.
So we'll look at some foundational ideas those stages learners tend to move through.
Okay.
We'll dig into the kind of surprising personal factors and even the nature of the skill itself that shapes your journey.
That sounds interesting.
And we'll explore how practice and feedback can be optimized, like how to make them really count.
Practical stuff. Good.
And we'll even touch on how our understanding of learning is, still evolving. It's not static.
Okay, get ready for some aha moments. Maybe a few unexpected insights into why learning feels tough sometimes.
And hopefully how to make it more effective.
Okay, let's jump in.
So if we're talking foundational ideas, we really have to start with a classic. Fitz and Posner, 1967.
Okay, Fitz and Posner.
They came up with this three-stage model. It basically describes the journey, mostly for motor skills, as they develop with practice.
Still used a lot today, you said.
Oh yeah, it's a really common lens. A good starting point.
So 3 stages. What stage 1 look like? What's going on for the learner then?
They called it the cognitive stage. Think of it as the thinking stage.
Cognitive? Okay. Thinking. Makes sense.
The learner's focus is purely on understanding what to do, grasping fundamentals, forming a mental picture. It's a lot of conscious effort, figuring things out.
Right, like reading the manual or watching someone else do it, trying to piece it together in your head first.
Exactly that. And performance-wise, high mental effort. Feels very deliberate, very conscious. You're thinking through every single step.
Which means errors.
Lots of errors. Frequent, often big ones, and inconsistent. Movements can look slow, jerky, kind of clumsy. And you're so focused on just getting the steps right, you might not even notice the smaller mistakes you're making.
This is totally my first attempt at parallel parking. Brain overload.
Absolutely. Cognitively, this stage is all about declarative knowledge, knowing that.
Knowing the rules, the facts, the sequence.
Right. It's active problem solving. And it demands a huge amount of attention. Hard to filter out distractions. You're literally building that first mental blueprint.
So practice here is a lot of trial and error, I guess. And feedback must be super important.
Definitely trial and error. And feedback. Vital. You need clear, simple instructions. Demonstrations help a lot. And frequent, immediate feedback on the big errors is key. You got to correct those before they stick.
And keep motivation up, I imagine. It sounds frustrating.
Yeah, positive feedback is really important too, but you often see pretty rapid gains right at the beginning as the absolute basics start to click.
Got it. Like learning guitar chords, maybe. Or practicing a dance step for the first time. Or even a surgical intern just following a checklist.
Precisely, all that initial conscious effort.
Okay. So with practice, you move on.
You move to stage 2. The associative stage, sometimes called the practice stage. But associative really hints at the mental shift happening.
Associative, so connecting things. The focus changes from what to how.
Exactly. The learner is now refining the skill. How to do it more smoothly, more efficiently, more consistently.
Okay.
They start linking environmental cues to the right actions, like seeing that opening on the court and just knowing when to pass without really thinking step by step about mechanics.
Ah, okay. So performance gets smoother,
Well,
less clunky.
much smoother, more fluid, more reliable. Errors drop significantly, they're smaller, less frequent, and consistency really starts to increase.
So those awkward beginner steps start disappearing.
Yes, and
Yeah.
cognitively, this is the crucial transition from declarative knowing that to procedural knowledge. knowing how.
Ah, the knowing how.
We're not thinking about every tiny detail anymore. The movements become more automatic, which frees up mental space.
Right.
And you get much better at detecting your own errors. You start to rely on that internal sensory feedback, how the movement feels, less dependent on someone else telling you.
Like, like finally being able to drive and hold a conversation without, messing up.
Perfect example.
Or a musician playing a familiar tune without staring at the notes.
Exactly. This stage is often the longest one. It takes extensive, consistent practice.
Makes sense.
And the feedback needed changes too. It becomes more about specific, nuanced guidance, refining technique, efficiency, not just that was wrong.
More fine-tuning.
Right. Practice here emphasizes linking your actions to the outcomes and learning to adapt to slightly varied conditions. Think of a figure skater working on a jump landing, or a carpenter getting really precise with their joints.
Okay, that's the associative stage, which brings us to stage 3.
The autonomous stage.
Autonomous. Sounds like automatic.
Pretty much. This is where the skill becomes second nature, truly automatic. The word autonomous means self-governing, right? That's what the skill feels like.
Minimal conscious thought needed to actually do it.
Exactly. Performance is highly consistent, accurate, efficient. And because executing the skill takes almost no conscious mental effort, your attention is freed up.
Free for what?
Higher level stuff, strategy, reacting to unpredictable things in the environment, monitoring other factors, or even, doing a completely separate task at the same time.
Like that elite athlete making split-second decisions during a game.
Or the experienced surgeon performing a standard procedure smoothly while keeping an eye on the patient's overall status.
Right. Or just walking for most adults.
Walking is a classic example. It's completely autonomous for most of us. This stage is driven by highly efficient, implicit procedural knowledge. You just do it.
And getting here takes time.
Oh, yeah. Reaching this level of true automaticity often requires years, maybe even decades of really dedicated practice. Not everyone reaches it for every skill they learn.
So looking back at Fitz and Posner, what's the big takeaway? The core insight?
The core insight, I think, is that learning isn't just about doing something more. It's a fundamental shift in how your brain processes it.
Okay.
You go from consciously thinking through every step to basically letting your body handle it automatically.
Right.
Errors are part of the process the whole way, but they change. And as you progress, that cognitive load, the mental effort needed just drops dramatically.
It gives us a kind of roadmap then.
Yeah.
Shows how needs change as you learn.
Exactly. It's a very useful framework.
But you mentioned it's just one lens. The sources brought up other models too, right?
They did, and that's important because, well, skill acquisition is complex. One model might not capture everything. Others offer different complementary perspectives.
Like Anne Gentile's model.
Gentiles is interesting. It's very focused on the goal of the movement and how you interact with the environment.
Okay. How does hers work?
She also has 2 stages, but they're defined differently. Stage 1 is about getting the idea of the movement, kind of like Fitz and Posner's cognitive stage, but also learning to pick out what's relevant in the environment versus what's noise.
Discriminating relevant conditions.
You got it.
And stage 2.
Stage 2 depends on the type of skill. This is key. For closed skills done in stable, predictable settings, like bowling or diving.
Free throws in basketball.
Perfect. The goal is fixation. You want to refine that one movement pattern for maximum consistency. Repeatability.
Okay. And the other type?
For open skills performed in dynamic, unpredictable environments, like playing soccer or wrestling or driving in traffic.
Surfing.
Definitely. The goal is diversification. You need to be adaptable. You need to be able to perform the skill effectively in many different ways, depending on what the situation throws at you.
That distinction, needing consistency versus needing adaptability, that feels really important.
It really highlights that the goal of your practice should be different depending on the skill you're learning. What you're aiming for changes.
Makes sense. What other models did the sources mention?
Well, there's the Dreyfus model. This one often comes up when talking about complex cognitive or professional skills, becoming an expert.
Right, not just motor skills.
Exactly. It lays out several stages, usually something like novice, advanced beginner, competent, proficient, and expert. Sometimes they add master.
And how's the progression described there? Is it similar?
It focuses on the shift in thinking and decision-making. The novice relies rigidly on context-free rules. Always do X.
Okay.
The advanced beginner starts using situational guidelines or maxims. Competent learners can start choosing perspectives and making plans. Proficient performers develop an intuitive grasp. They see the whole picture differently.
And the expert.
The expert acts fluidly, intuitively, almost seamlessly, and the master might even operate beyond that, potentially transforming the field. The key shift is from explicit rules to this deep, tacit, embodied understanding.
So this is more about becoming like a chess grandmaster or a top-level diagnostic physician.
Exactly. It captures that journey from just following instructions to truly understanding and operating intuitively.
Fascinating. Any others stand out?
Another really interesting perspective comes from Bernstein, a Russian neurophysiologist. His model is much more biomechanical.
Biomechanical, how so?
He focused on the problem of controlling the sheer number of ways our body can move. All the joints, muscles. He called it the degrees of freedom problem.
Right, like trying to consciously control every single joint angle and muscle tension. That sounds impossible.
It is, initially. So, learning, for Bernstein, is about solving this motor problem. Early on, learners might actually freeze some joints or muscles, limit their options to make it manageable.
Okay, simplify it.
Yeah. Then with practice, they learn to unfreeze and coordinate these degrees of freedom more effectively, more efficiently. His model has phases like determining control, finding a motor strategy, using sensory feedback for corrections, automating those corrections.
What's the core idea from Bernstein?
A really key concept is repetition without repetition.
Repetition without repetition. What does that mean?
He argued that just repeating the exact same movement over and over isn't actually the best way to learn, especially for adaptability. You need to practice variations, solve the same movement problem under slightly different conditions each time. He famously contrasted learning a skill isn't like drilling multiplication tables where the answer is always the same. It's more like learning algebra, where you understand the underlying principles and can apply them flexibly to solve different problems.
Oh, okay. So practice needs variability to build adaptability. That really pushes back against just mindless drilling.
It does. And then you have models that focus more on implicit learning, like the predictive cycle model from Tadlock and Stone.
Implicit learning. Learning without consciously knowing you're learning.
Sort of. It suggests a lot of skill development happens through trial and error, but without necessarily needing a conscious understanding of how all the components work. You're conscious of the goal, the outcome you want, but not necessarily the micro adjustments your brain makes.
So you try something, it doesn't work, and your brain just figures it out subconsciously for the next try.
Essentially, yes, it's a cycle. Attempt, fail. Implicitly analyze what went wrong. Implicitly decide how to adjust attempt. Attempt again. Your brain is constantly remodeling neural networks based on the outcomes, often below the level of conscious awareness.
Wow. That challenges Fitz and Posner's cognitive stage, doesn't it? The idea that you have to consciously think it through first.
It suggests there are powerful learning pathways that don't require that explicit cognitive effort, especially early on. It happens more than we realize.
Any other quick mentions from the sources?
Briefly, yeah. Schema theory came up the idea that we develop generalized motor programs, or schemas, that we can adapt, and that practicing with variability is key to building robust schemas.
Okay.
Ecological dynamics offers a very different view. Skills aren't stored programs, but they emerge from the continuous interaction between you, the task, and the environment.
Emerge, like they just happen.
In a way, yeah, through self-organization. And social learning theory, of course, reminds us how much we learn just by watching others, imitating them, observational learning.
Okay, wow. So we've got Fitz and Posner, Gentile, Dreyfus, Bernstein, implicit learning, schemas, ecological dynamics. It's a lot of different ways to look at this. What does this whole menu of theories mean for someone actually trying to learn something?
I think it means there isn't one single rigid path. The best way to think about it, or the most useful insights, probably depend on the skill itself.
Like, is it motor or
Yeah.
cognitive?
Yeah.
Simple or complex?
Exactly. Is it a closed skill needing consistency or an open skill needing adaptability? What's the ultimate goal? Accuracy, flexibility.
Right.
But, many of these models, despite their differences, point to a similar underlying theme. That journey involves a shift away from conscious, effortful control towards something more automatic, intuitive, or seamlessly adaptive. They just highlight different facets of that complex process.
So that describes the path. But we know the path isn't the same for everyone. Some people pick things up faster, some struggle more. What shapes that individual journey?
Ah, yes. This is where we get into the factors that act as the sort of engine and compass for learning. It's definitely not uniform. Your unique path is influenced by a whole bunch of internal and external things.
Let's start inside the learner. What about you personally matters?
Okay, first off, prior experience. Huge factor.
What do you already know?
Yeah. Learning something new is often way easier if you can transfer skills or knowledge from something similar you've done before.
Like if you played ice hockey. Maybe learning golf is a bit easier because the swing mechanics have some overlap.
Exactly. Or basketball skills transferring to netball. You're adapting neural pathways and motor patterns that are already established, at least partially. It gives you a head start.
Okay. What else inside the learner? How you feel about it?
Crucial. Confidence, or what psychologists call self-efficacy. Your belief in your own ability to succeed at the task.
That makes a difference.
A massive difference. And it's not fixed, right? You build it through success. That's why structuring learning with early wins, starting simple and gradually increasing complexity, is so important.
Builds momentum.
Yeah, it fuels motivation, persistence when things get tough, even your willingness to take risks and try new things. Keeps the mindset positive.
What about things we maybe can't control so much?
Hmm.
Like genetics,
Heredity does play a role. It can set certain potential ranges or predispositions.
like body type maybe?
Yeah.
Muscle fiber composition.
Exactly. Height, processing speed, things like that. Genetics might give someone a natural advantage or make certain skills easier to acquire, but
What?
whether you actually reach those genetic limits depends entirely on your environment and your training. Genetics might open a door, but you still have to walk through it and do the work.
So you can still get really good even if you don't have the perfect genes for something.
Absolutely. You can achieve very high levels of competence through dedicated effort, even without what might be considered elite genetics for that specific activity.
Is that different from what people call talent?
It's related, but maybe slightly different. Innate abilities or talent are often described as that sort of natural ease, a seemingly effortless superiority in some aspect right from the start.
Like someone with amazing reaction time or perfect pitch.
Yeah, or incredible visual acuity, or maybe just super fast cognitive processing. It often shows up early. It probably relates to having very efficient neural pathways for that particular thing.
Okay.
But it's useful to distinguish that natural predisposition from the skill itself, which always needs to be honed through practice. And sometimes the skills you really had to work hard for feel more valuable, because you know the effort involved.
Yeah, definitely. What about personality? Does that factor in?
Oh, for sure. Personality traits like determination, patience, how you handle frustration, how cooperative you are, these significantly influence learning.
How so?
Well, learners who are more receptive to feedback, who persist through those inevitable plateaus, who can work well with coaches or peers, they generally tend to progress more effectively. It impacts engagement, motivation, sticking with the practice schedule.
So these learner factors, experience, confidence, genetics, talent, personalities, they don't operate in isolation, do they?
Not at all. They interact in really complex ways. Raw talent isn't much use without motivation and persistence.
Right.
And a weakness in one area, maybe lower innate ability for something, can often be compensated for by strengths elsewhere, like incredible determination or a knack for strategy.
And some of these are changeable.
That's key.
Mhm.
Things like confidence and motivation are very malleable. You can actively work on building them. Expertise is very often made through effort and strategy, not just something you're born with.
Okay. What about just time? Does simply having more experience or being older automatically make you better?
Well, long exposure definitely helps build domain-specific knowledge, pattern recognition. That's undeniable. But experience alone doesn't fully explain expertise, especially in complex areas like decision-making.
How so?
You see variability. Some people with less time in the field can demonstrate expert-level decision-making, maybe due to other factors like deliberate practice or innate abilities. Age itself can have complex effects, too.
Like,
One study mentioned in the sources looked at expert rugby players. It actually found a slight negative correlation between age and decision-making accuracy among the experts.
really? Older wasn't better?
In that specific cognitive skill at that elite level, apparently not. It suggests younger, highly talented individuals can sometimes develop expert-like capabilities quite quickly. And just being at a high competitive level doesn't always predict performance on all aspects of expertise, particularly those really nuanced cognitive skills.
Interesting. Okay, let's switch gears slightly. You mentioned an engine earlier, motivation. How does that drive learning?
Motivation is absolutely the driving force. It's what gets you started, keeps you putting in the effort, and makes you persist when it gets difficult or tedious.
And there are different kinds, right? Intrinsic and extrinsic.
Exactly. Intrinsic motivation comes from within. You do it because you genuinely enjoy it, find it interesting, or get a sense of satisfaction and mastery from it.
And extrinsic.
Extrinsic motivation is driven by external factors, rewards like praise, grades, money, status, or maybe avoiding punishment or criticism.
And is one better than the other?
Generally, intrinsic motivation is considered more sustainable for long-term learning and leads to deeper engagement. That internal drive, curiosity, passion that keeps you going.
But extrinsic can work.
Oh yeah, extrinsic rewards can be powerful motivators, especially for getting started or pushing through specific, maybe less enjoyable tasks. But the risk is becoming dependent on the reward or burning out if the reward is removed or feels controlling. Often, a balanced approach, leveraging both, works best.
Self-determination theory came up in the sources here too.
It did. SDT is really relevant. It highlights 3 fundamental psychological needs that are crucial for fostering that intrinsic motivation. Autonomy. Feeling like you have some control and choice in your learning. Competence. Feeling effective, like you're making progress and mastering this skill. And relatedness. Feeling connected to others, a sense of belonging.
So giving learners choices, structuring things for success, creating a supportive community that boosts motivation.
Massively. It taps into those core needs.
And setting goals. Does that help keep the engine running?
Absolutely critical, both for getting started and for maintaining motivation over the long haul. Setting SMART goals specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound gives you direction and focus. Breaking down big, daunting goals into smaller, manageable steps is also key. It provides opportunities to see progress, celebrate milestones, which is especially important for fueling the kind of effort needed for, say, deliberate practice.
Okay, so we have the learner, their motivation. What about the skill itself? Does the nature of the task change how we learn it?
Definitely. The characteristics of the skill itself play a big role. First, task complexity. Obviously, more complex skills generally take longer to learn and involve more nuanced transitions between stages.
Makes sense.
And as we touched on with Gentile's model, that distinction between open versus closed skills is vital.
Right. Closed is stable, predictable, like bowling. Open is dynamic, unpredictable, like soccer.
Exactly. Learning a closed skill where the goal is consistency, fixation, often requires different practice strategies than learning an open skill where the goal is adaptability, diversification.
You practice them differently.
You should, ideally. And then there's the basic structure, discrete versus continuous versus serial skills.
Remind me.
Discrete skills have a clear beginning and end, like throwing a ball or flipping a switch. Continuous skills are repetitive, often rhythmic, like running, swimming, or cycling. Serial skills are a chain of discrete skills linked together in sequence, like starting a car or performing a gymnastics routine.
And why does that matter?
It influences things like the optimal way to structure practice. For example, whether massed practice, cramming, or distributed practice, spreading it out, is likely to be more effective.
Okay, so bringing all these factors together, the learner, their motivation, the skill itself, it's not a simple formula, is it?
Not at all. It's a complex, dynamic interplay. Your individual learning journey is unique. It's shaped by who you are, what you bring to the table, why you're learning, and the specific challenges of the skill itself.
Understanding these factors helps explain why people learn differently, even with the same instruction.
Exactly. And it highlights areas where you, as a learner or as a teacher, can actively influence the process. It's not just predetermined.
Okay, so we have the models for the path.
Yeah.
And we understand the factors influencing the journey. Now let's get into the real nuts and bolts. How do we actually optimize learning, practice, and feedback?
Right. This is where the science gets really practical and actionable, because it's not just about putting the hours, is it?
No, quality over just quantity.
Precisely. It's about putting in the right kind of hours and getting the right kind of information back about your performance. And a huge concept here is deliberate practice.
So deliberate practice, associated with K. Anders Ericsson, right?
Maybe name most strongly linked with it, yeah.
And this isn't just practicing a lot or mindlessly repeating something.
Absolutely not. That's maybe just practice or repetition. Deliberate practice is different. It's highly structured, intensely focused effort, and it's specifically designed to improve a particular aspect of your performance, often one you're weak at.
It's targeted.
Vary. It's usually individualized, maybe designed with a coach or expert teacher. It involves repetition, yes, but repetition with constant refinement. And crucially, it pushes you just beyond your current capabilities.
Into that challenge zone.
Yeah.
Not too easy, not overwhelmingly hard.
Exactly. Often called the zone of proximal development. It requires sustained effort and intense concentration. It's not necessarily fun.
Okay, so what are the key ingredients? What makes practice deliberate?
Well, high motivation is essential because it's hard work. Setting very specific, often short-term goals, maintaining focused attention during the practice, really concentrating, getting immediate and informative feedback.
Feedback is key again.
Absolutely. Either from an expert observer or by developing really good self-monitoring skills. Working on tasks that are appropriately challenging just outside your comfort zone, and then actively engaging in refinement and self-correction based on that feedback. It's about systematically finding weaknesses and addressing them head-on.
That sounds intense, but you can see how it would lead to high proficiency, much more than just playing for fun.
It's often considered the engine behind reaching truly elite levels in many fields. It directly contrasts with just routine practice or play.
Okay, so that's the type of practice. What about how we structure it?
Right. Beyond what you practice, how you organize that practice time makes a big difference.
You mentioned massed versus distributed earlier, like cramming versus spreading it out.
Exactly. Mass practice involves long practice sessions with short breaks, maybe cramming it all into one day. Distributed practice uses shorter, more frequent sessions spread out over time with longer rest periods in between.
And distributed is generally better.
Almost always, yes. Especially for long-term retention and the ability to transfer the skill to new situations, and particularly for continuous skills.
Why is that?
Several reasons. It helps reduce fatigue, both physical and mental. It allows for memory consolidation to happen during the rest periods your brain keeps working on it subconsciously. Mass practice might feel productive initially, but distributed leads to more durable learning.
When might mass practice be okay?
Maybe for learning very simple, discrete skills quickly, or when motivation is high and you just need to get a basic grasp initially. But for long-term mastery, distributed usually wins.
Okay. What about practicing different skills within a session? You mentioned blocked versus random.
Yes, this is a fascinating and powerful finding, often called the contextual interference effect.
Contextual interference.
Right.
Sounds like making things harder.
It does. Okay, so block practice is when you practice one skill repeatedly before moving to the next. Think 50 tennis forehands, then 50 backhands, then 50 serves, triple A, BBB, CCC.
Right. That feels logical. You focus on one thing.
And it feels good. Performance tends to improve rapidly during that practice block. You feel like you're getting it. But random practice is when you mix up the skills unpredictably within the session. Forehand, serve, backhand, volley, serve, forehand, ABC, CAB, BCA.
That sounds chaotic.
Yeah.
And probably more frustrating. You'd make more mistakes.
You absolutely do. Initial performance during random practice is almost always worse than during blocked practice. It feels less successful, more effortful, maybe even discouraging.
So why do it?
Because for long-term retention and, crucially, the ability to transfer that skill to a real game or performance situation, random practice is consistently shown to be superior.
Wow. So making it harder during practice makes learning better in the long run.
Exactly. It's what researchers call a desirable difficulty. The struggle forces your brain to work harder. Every time you switch skills, you have to actively retrieve or reconstruct the plan for that skill rather than just repeating what you did seconds ago.
More effortful process.
Yes, deeper, more elaborate processing. It makes the memory stronger, less dependent on the specific context of that practice block, and ultimately more flexible and adaptable. It aligns with something called the challenge point framework, finding that optimal level of difficulty where you're challenged but can still succeed enough to learn.
So if practice feels really easy and smooth, maybe you're not optimizing for long-term learning.
Often that's the case. If it's too easy, you might just be performing something you already know well, not necessarily building more robust skill.
Interesting. What about variable practice? Is that related?
It is related and also crucial. Variable practice means practicing a single skill but under varied conditions. If you're practicing shooting in basketball, you shoot from different spots on the court, maybe with defenders present sometimes, using slightly different balls. If you're learning a piece of music, maybe practice it at different tempos or on different instruments.
Why is that important?
It builds adaptability and generalizability. It helps you develop a more robust schema or mental model for the skill that can handle variations. This is especially critical for open skills, where the environment is constantly changing. You need to be able to perform effectively under lots of different conditions.
Okay, so structure practice. with distribution, randomness, and variability for best long-term results, even if it feels harder initially.
That's a great summary of the key principles.
Now, what about feedback? We keep coming back to its importance. How does that fit into optimizing learning?
Feedback is absolutely essential. It's the information you get about your performance that allows you to identify errors, reinforce correct actions, and guide future attempts.
And there's feedback from ourselves and feedback from others.
Exactly. We distinguish between intrinsic feedback, that's the sensory information coming from your own body as you perform the movement, how it feels, proprioception, how it looks, how it sounds.
Your internal sense of correctness.
Right. And then there's extrinsic feedback, also called augmented feedback, which comes from an external source.
Like a coach, a teammate, a video replay, a sensor.
Precisely. And this extrinsic feedback can be broken down further. Two main types are often discussed: knowledge of results, KR, and knowledge of performance, KP.
KR and KP, what's the difference?
Knowledge of results, KR, is information about the outcome of your action. Did the ball go in the basket? What was your time in the race? Did you hit the target? It tells you about the goal achievement.
Okay, and KP?
Knowledge of performance, KP, is information about the quality of the movement pattern itself, the process. Things like your elbow was too low during that throw, or your weight shift was much smoother that time. It's about the kinematics or the form.
Got it. Outcome versus movement quality. Now, you said earlier that how often you get feedback matters a lot.
Hugely. The frequency or schedule of extrinsic feedback is critical for long-term learning.
So giving feedback after every single try, that's not ideal.
It might seem helpful, especially for a complete beginner, right? That's continuous feedback. But the research strongly suggests it can actually be detrimental in the long run.
Why? Too much hand-holding.
Kind of. It can lead to feedback dependency. The learner relies entirely on the external feedback and doesn't develop the crucial skill of attending to their own intrinsic feedback and learning to self-correct. There's something called the guidance hypothesis.
Guidance hypothesis.
Yeah, it suggests that too much external guidance basically prevents the learner from doing the important information processing work themselves. It helps performance during practice, but often harms retention and transfer later on when the feedback isn't there.
So again, like with random practice, maybe less is more. Sometimes. Less external feedback later on.
Generally, yes, for promoting durable learning and self-sufficiency. Using reduced frequency feedback, giving it only on some trials, or variable frequency, giving it unpredictably, encourages learners to process their intrinsic feedback more deeply and engage in more active problem solving.
What are some ways to reduce frequency effectively?
Well, you can use phased feedback, where you start with more frequent feedback for a novice and gradually reduce it as they improve. This helps them transition towards relying on themselves.
Makes sense.
You can use summary feedback, where you provide feedback after a block of, say, 5 or 10 trials, summarizing the key points. This encourages the learner to analyze their performance across multiple attempts.
Okay.
Or bandwidth feedback. This is interesting. You set an acceptable bandwidth or range of error. You only give feedback if the performance falls outside that range.
So no news is good news.
Exactly. The absence of feedback implicitly tells the learner they were within the acceptable tolerance. This reduces overall feedback frequency, prevents correcting tiny errors the learner could fix themselves, and the lack of negative feedback acts as reinforcement.
Clever. What about self-controlled feedback? You mentioned that sounded promising.
It really is. This is where the learner gets to decide when they want to receive feedback. Maybe they raise their hand or press a button after a trial where they want input.
And that works well. Why?
The results are often excellent. When learners have control, they tend to be more motivated, more engaged, they process the feedback they do receive more deeply, and ultimately learn more effectively. They often ask for feedback after trials they think were good, maybe to confirm their own assessment, or after trials where they felt something was off but aren't sure what. It taps right into that need for autonomy from self-determination theory.
Very powerful. Okay, one more thing on feedback. Timing. Immediate versus delayed.
Right. Does it need to be instantaneous? Not always. Immediate feedback, right after the action, can be good for novices to make quick corrections and avoid practicing errors.
But
Delayed feedback, waiting even just a few seconds, or sometimes longer, can actually be better for long-term retention and transfer.
why would delaying it help?
It gives the learner a chance to first process their own intrinsic feedback and attempt their own error analysis. How did that feel? What do I think went wrong? Then, when the external feedback comes, they can compare it to their own assessment, leading to deeper cognitive processing and better learning.
Wow, okay. So much nuance in practice and feedback design.
There really is. The key takeaway is that the optimal strategy isn't one size fits all. It depends on the learner's stage, the type of skill, the learning goals, but embracing these ideas like deliberate practice, distributed schedules, desirable difficulties through randomness and variability, and using feedback smartly, maybe reducing frequency over time or empowering the learner with self-control, these can make a huge difference in building robust, adaptable skills. And managing that cognitive load at each stage is always key.
So how do we pull all this together? If you're teaching someone or if you're trying to learn something yourself, how do you actually apply these concepts?
Yeah, understanding these principles is incredibly useful on the ground. If you're teaching or coaching, you can really tailor your approach based on where the learner is at, using Fitz and Posner as a rough guide.
Okay, so for that cognitive stage, the real beginner, the thinking stage.
Keep it simple. Break the skill down into small, manageable parts. Use clear, concise instructions. Demonstrations are great, maybe visual aids. Use short verbal cues.
Less talking, more showing.
Often, yeah. Keep the practice environment basic. Minimize distractions. And provide frequent, immediate, mainly positive feedback, focusing on correcting just the major errors first. Don't overwhelm them. Create a supportive atmosphere where mistakes are seen as normal.
Like that tennis serve example.
Mm,
Maybe just focus on the grip, the stance, the basic toss motion. Give immediate feedback if the toss is consistently way off.
exactly. Keep the cognitive load manageable.
Then, for the associative stage, when they're starting to connect the dots and refine.
You can start weaning them off constant cues. The focus shifts to refining technique, improving consistency, making it more efficient. This requires lots of practice.
The longest stage, you said.
Often, yes.
Right.
Now you can gradually introduce more variability and complexity into the practice. Feedback becomes more specific, more corrective, focusing on the finer points of the movement.
Okay.
And crucially, encourage the learner to pay attention to their intrinsic feedback. Ask them, how did that feel? Start reducing the frequency of your external feedback to push them towards self-evaluation and self-correction.
So the tennis player is now practicing hundreds of serves, maybe getting specific feedback on wrist snap for topspin, and they're starting to develop that internal feel for a good serve versus a bad one.
Precisely. They're associating the feel with the outcome.
And finally, for the autonomous stage, when it's pretty much automatic.
Now the practice needs to shift again. Focus on strategic application, performing under pressure, handling complex, unpredictable environments.
More game-like situations.
Definitely. High-challenge scenarios are key. External feedback becomes much less frequent. It might focus on fine-tuning under pressure, strategic decision-making, or adapting to really novel situations, or just maintaining motivation. Much of the feedback is now internal, based on the performer's own vast experience.
So the tennis player is now working on serve placement to exploit an opponent's weakness, varying spin and speed strategically, practicing maintaining composure on break points.
Exactly. The focus is on using the highly automated skill effectively in context.
It really sounds like high-quality instruction and coaching is essential throughout this whole process.
It makes a huge difference. A good instructor doesn't just watch. They design effective practice, provide the right kind of feedback at the right time, help diagnose problems, and crucially, foster motivation and confidence. Think about really good apprenticeship programs. They often embody these principles. Systematic skill breakdown, reinforcement, guided practice towards generalization.
What about technology? You see VR, AR, wearables being used more. How do they fit in?
Technology can definitely be a powerful tool to enhance learning, but it needs to be integrated thoughtfully. It's not magic.
How could it help at different stages?
Well, in the cognitive stage, VR or AR could provide really immersive demonstrations, maybe overlay instructions, reduce the initial mental load, or allow safe exploration of complex environments.
Okay.
In the associative stage, wearable sensors can provide objective, real-time feedback on movement quality, things a coach might miss, like precise joint angles, speed, acceleration.
Data-driven feedback.
Right. And for the autonomous stage, VR can be great for simulating complex, high-pressure scenarios like surgeons practicing emergency procedures or pilots dealing with simulated failures to hone decision-making and performance under stress.
But you need good teaching alongside it.
Absolutely. Tech complements, it doesn't replace. Sound instructional design and human interaction. There are challenges too, like cost, technical glitches, making sure the feedback is actually useful and not overwhelming.
Okay. So switching hats, what about actionable tips for us, the listeners, when we're the ones trying to learn something new?
Great question. Based on all this, what can you do? First, Set those SMART goals, know what you're aiming for.
Be specific.
Yes. Then break down the skill. Don't try to swallow it whole. Master smaller components first. Embrace mistakes, seriously. See them as information, not failures. Analyze why it went wrong and adjust.
Easier said than done sometimes.
True. Also, actively seek out and use feedback, but learn to filter it and don't become totally dependent. Develop your own internal sense. Practice in varied contexts. Don't just practice in the exact same way every time, especially if adaptability matters.
Mix it up.
Yeah. Reflect on your learning. Take a moment after practice. What worked, what didn't, what felt right. Maybe keep a simple journal. Focus on the process, not just the end result. Enjoy the journey of getting better. And crucially, take breaks and rest. Your brain needs downtime to consolidate learning. Avoid burnout.
Any quick tips based on which stage you think you're in?
Sure. If you feel you're in that initial cognitive stage, be patient, focus on the absolute basics, watch others carefully, expect errors, ask questions.
Okay, it's associative.
Associative stage. Commit to consistent practice, really focus on refining the movement, work on reducing errors, and pay close attention to that intrinsic feel. Start trying to self-correct based on how it felt.
And autonomous.
Pushing towards the autonomous stage. Challenge yourself. Practice under pressure in complex situations. Focus on strategy, adaptability, and maintaining performance when it counts.
It really sounds like a holistic approach is needed, whether teaching or learning.
Absolutely. You can't just look at the stage. You have to consider the individual learner, their motivation, confidence, background, and the specific demands of the skill. Remember, learning isn't always linear. Plateaus happen, regression happens. Flexibility is key.
And explaining why you're using certain practice methods can help.
Definitely. It empowers the learner, taps into that autonomy need, help them understand why random practice feels hard but is good for them, embrace those desirable difficulties, and integrate technology thoughtfully as a support, not the main driver.
Okay. We've covered a ton of ground with these models and practical strategies.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the science is still evolving. These stage models like Fitz and Posner, they have their critics, right?
They do, and it's important to acknowledge that while they provide a really useful framework, especially for practitioners, critics point out some limitations. One main critique is non-linearity.
Learning isn't always a smooth uphill climb.
Exactly. Real-world learning often involves plateaus, periods of little apparent progress, maybe even temporary dips in performance. These can be influenced by all sorts of things: motivation, fatigue, stress, changes in technique, external factors. Stage models can sometimes present an overly smooth picture.
And maybe too simplistic. Doesn't capture everyone's path.
That's another point. Oversimplification and individual variability. Learners progress at different rates. They might emphasize different aspects, maybe even seem to skip or revisit stages depending on the task and their background. A rigid stage model might not capture that unique journey.
There was also a point about assuming the stages are real.
Yeah, the critique of the a priori assumption. Are these distinct stages truly universal psychological realities that everyone passes through in order? Or are they more like useful theoretical constructs, helpful ways for us to categorize and think about a complex, continuous process? Some research, like a study on language acquisition, found different stage-like patterns depending on whether they measured comprehension or production, suggesting the stages might be partly an artifact of what you measure or the specific skill.
This is where those other perspectives, like dynamic systems and ecological dynamics, offer a different way of thinking.
Precisely. They challenge the traditional idea that learning is mainly about building fixed motor programs inside your head that you just run off.
So what do they emphasize instead?
From a dynamic systems perspective, learning is seen more as a process of self-organization. Skills aren't pre-programmed. They emerge from the complex, continuous interaction between your body, muscles, joints, nervous system, the task you're trying to accomplish, and the environment you're in.
Emerge.
The system naturally settles into the most stable and effective movement pattern available, given all the constraints and possibilities. It's less like installing software, more like water finding the easiest path down a hill.
Okay. And ecological dynamics?
Ecological dynamics builds on this, focusing heavily on the perception-action coupling, how we perceive information in the environment and how that directly shapes our actions.
Perceiving affordances.
Exactly. Learning involves becoming attuned to the affordances the environment offers the opportunities for action. Seeing a gap in traffic as an affordance for merging, or judging the slope of a hill as an affordance for walking or climbing. Skill development is about refining these direct perception-action links, so you see something relevant, and your body just knows how to respond appropriately, often without conscious thought.
So skills are more fluid, context dependent.
Very much so. They emerge from the interaction, they're shaped by the specific situation. This view really challenges the idea of rigid, stored programs and fixed stages. It aligns nicely with Bernstein's repetition without repetition, practicing variations to become adaptable to different contexts.
These newer views seem to place more emphasis on the learner's immediate interaction with the world, maybe their subjective experience too.
They do. They bring the environment and the learner's perception right into the core of what skill is, rather than seeing them as just external factors influencing an internal program. They also potentially make more room for the learner's internal state, fatigue, focus, confidence as integral parts of the skill execution system.
So is the field moving towards a more holistic, individualized view overall?
It seems that way. There's a shift away from thinking solely in terms of fixed motor programs towards understanding more adaptive control systems that constantly adjust based on feedback and context. There's definitely a growing appreciation for how unique individual differences shape learning pathways.
Expertise is complicated.
Very. It involves perception, cognition, strategy, decision-making, all woven together, not just thousands of hours of practice, and new theoretical frameworks like predictive processing, the idea that the brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. Learning by minimizing prediction errors might offer ways to potentially bridge some of these cognitive and ecological perspectives in the future.
What does all this evolution in thinking mean for practical learning and teaching?
Well, if learning is more nonlinear, emergent, and context-dependent, maybe the instructor's role shifts slightly. Perhaps less being a director dictating the one correct technique and more being a facilitator of discovery.
How so?
Designing rich, variable practice environments where the learner can actively explore, problem solve, and discover effective movement solutions for themselves, with guidance, of course. The stage models, though, they remain really useful heuristics for practitioners.
Your sakes, like helpful rules of thumb?
Exactly. They give coaches and learners a valuable, simplified way to think about progression and tailor instruction, even if the underlying theory is complex and debated. And, maybe the challenges researchers sometimes face in replicating skill acquisition studies perfectly just reflects how deeply complex and context-dependent learning really is in the real world.
Wow, okay. That was a truly deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground on how we master skills.
Yeah, we've explored those classic stage models like Fitz and Posner, looked at all the factors that shape our individual journeys from prior experience and confidence to motivation and the task itself.
And dug into optimizing practice and feedback, deliberate practice, desirable difficulties like random and variable practice, smart feedback strategies.
Right, and touched on how the science is still evolving, bringing in ideas from dynamic systems and ecological dynamics for a more, maybe, holistic view.
And understanding these principles, it really can change how you approach learning any skill, can it? Whether it's sports, music, work tasks, anything.
Absolutely. It gives you a framework, helps you set realistic expectations, maybe choose better practice strategies, understand why you hit plateaus, interpret feedback more effectively.
And maybe be a bit kinder to yourself during the process. It's a shortcut to being well-informed about how competence and mastery actually develop.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought to leave you with. Consider that intricate dance, that constant interplay between your own internal stuff, your genetics maybe, your confidence, your personality, your drive, and the external world.
The task itself, the environment, the coaching you get.
Exactly. How do you think you can best navigate and maybe even influence that dance to reach your own learning goals? After everything we've discussed, what's the one nugget, the one idea that stands out most to you?